Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be here. Alex, thanks very much for that. What he really means is I've been around a long time. I'm a bit of an old fart as far as politicians go, but it's always good to get out of Westminster. But I was particularly keen to come to this when Neil invited me, because this is a session which does politicians like me a lot of good. You know, our job's to debate policy, it's to pass legislation, and too often we don't get enough opportunities to hear what things are like on the front line from the people who are trying to make the services and support work, or from those who are often needing and receiving some of those services and then part of trying to improve them as well. And so, to be quite honest, you'd probably learn more from Alex Bax than you will from me. So I'll try and make a contribution which sets a bit of a context for the discussion I hope we can have. And this is a great little audience, tight in the room, quite hot, but we've got a real spread of people. Katrina's from the health service in Yarmouth, Dave's from local authority in North East Links, Claire's from Oxfordshire and the charity sector, and that's a sort of good mix before we even get to Maeve and to Paul as well. So it's a particularly good opportunity, and I'm welcome being part of the discussion we're going to have. The timing of it couldn't be better, Alex, as you say, right on the eve of the implementation of the Homelessness Reduction Act. And this is a piece of legislation that from the start has had all party support. I lead for Labour nationally on housing and planning. We backed it from the start with two conditions. First, that the government would fund fully the new duties that it was putting, especially on local authorities, and it has not, as far as anyone so far has told me. You may tell me different. And secondly, that it also recognised that you can't legislate to end homelessness. You've got to tackle the root causes of homelessness, and they are not. Now, it was almost 18 months ago when this legislation was first debated in the House of Commons. And sad to say, the homelessness problems have got worse during that time, as they have every year since 2010. And you'll know what the picture's like and the position's like in your own areas, but nationally, we've now got a situation where we've got almost 80,000 households in temporary accommodation, 120,000 children. We've got the level of households accepted each year as statutorily homeless, up by more than 50% since 2010, and of course rough sleeping has almost trebled over that period of government. And when I think about the implementation of the Act, the picture may be different in different areas, the pressure probably is different in different areas, but it remains most acute in London. And having a look at some of the figures the other day for London about what people are trying, like you are trying to deliver, it sort of tells a story to me, which I'd be interested to check out with you. And it's this. In London, we've seen over the last 7 years, the number of people who are accepted as homeless with a duty to house up by over 50% across London over that period. But over that period, interestingly, we've seen the number that local authorities together across London are helping with relief and prevention actually fall a bit. What that tells me is that, especially in areas like London, we're in the worst possible situation as we go into the implementation of the Act, with authorities increasingly concentrating on doing what they have a legal duty to do and not doing some of the things that they feel are needed or might also want to do. And I'd be interested in your views on that. So in circumstances in a situation like this, what frustrates the hell out of me is the lack of, I suppose, urgency that I get from government about really doing anything about this. The lack of ambition, I think, is shameful for all of us. You know, when you've got a government saying we're going to end rough sleeping in this country, but not for 10 years, and what we'll do over the next 5 years is halve rough sleeping, so that by 2022 it's still higher than it was in 2010, you know, we're falling well short of what's needed. And when I talk about tackling the root causes of homelessness, I don't just mean some of the things that you will encounter day in, day out and try and help, from mental or marital breakdown, from people's tenancies ending and them being evicted, for people losing their job and not being able to keep up the payments, and the variety of personal circumstances that often lead to the homelessness risk or the homelessness. I mean, because I'm a politician, this is my job, I mean the root causes that I think you can trace for the relentlessly and rapidly rising level of homelessness to some of the decisions that have been taken in recent years by government. 13 cuts to housing benefit since 2010. Breaking the link between the local housing allowance and the rise in rents. Are we okay for the power here? Do you just want me to carry on? So apologies if anybody's sort of watching in from remotely and we've lost them. So big changes to the social security system. Part of the root causes of why we've got a rising problem now. A failure to step in and regulate the private rented market to give renters better security, when the biggest cause of homelessness now is a failure of private rents. A 45% cut in the special programme of funding supporting people over this period. And of course, you can't help the homeless in the end unless you build the homes, and you've got the homes, and axing entirely, probably the first government since the Second World War that has axed entirely central government support for building new general needs affordable social rented homes. So those are the root causes in policy terms why we've got this rapidly rising homelessness. This is the context into which the Homelessness Reduction Act is being introduced. Something I say we support. It's a useful step, but it won't solve the homelessness crisis, because that requires something bigger, it requires something bolder, it requires something much more urgent from government ministers. And for me, the tragedy of this is that we know what works because we've done it before. When Labour was in government in the early 2000s, there was also a rapidly rising level of homelessness, statutory and rough sleeping. And we brought a whole set of things together, new legislation for rights for people to homelessness help, special supporting funding for frontline services and for individuals, a group at the heart of government to knock heads in Whitehall together to make things happen. And then, you know, we saw the results over the period. So by 2010, Crisis and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, in their independent homelessness monitor, were able to declare an unprecedented decline in homelessness over that period. And we saw rough sleeping virtually disappear from our streets and cut by 3/4 over that period. And so I'm happy to answer questions. I won't go into detail now, really, but if Labour were to get into government, as we hope we will and we're campaigning to do, then things would be very different. Week one, we'd have a task force set up that Jeremy Corbyn, as Prime Minister, personally would lead. He's made that commitment to homelessness. We've made the commitment on rough sleeping, we'd end that within a parliament. We've set aside a plan for further funding for the frontline intervention services and a stable, certain supporting system for supported housing and some of the hostels. And we would require from housing associations for them to do what they did before, only in London, to set up what is known now as the clearinghouse scheme. We'd require them to set homes aside for people with a history of rough sleeping when they're ready to try and settle and get themselves settled again. And we as a government would help fund the replacement of those social rented homes over the following 2 years. We'd do that in London to double the capacity, and we'd do that across the country where it's also needed. Now I'm going to end on a couple of points just to try and be upbeat, and I think because it's very, I think it's easy in the field we're in, particularly when we're in debates like this, to feel that it's really all tough, and it is. But let me give you a couple of reasons to be upbeat. My job as leading for Labour is to try and make the case for change. My aim in doing that is to try and get other people beyond the political world and of other political parties willing to argue and back the same sort of case as I'm arguing for Labour. And we are making some headway on that. So we're winning some of the arguments that some of you have been involved in helping on getting government to rethink their plans for supported housing funding in the future. We're winning it on recognising that there's a need to build new social rented homes again. And we've won it recently with what was a landmark in many ways, a political landmark in Parliament a month ago. And it was this. We had Conservative ministers backing a Labour bill to give tenants a right to be able to take their landlord to court themselves without need to go to a local authority for enforcement if they're not willing to keep their home and maintain the home up to a level which is fit for human habitation. Now in this day and age that shouldn't be necessary, but it is. This was a similar bill that they blocked 3 years ago. It's the same legislation that they voted down 2 years ago, but they're now accepting it. So this means whether you're a renter in private rented, housing association or council rented, if your landlord isn't willing to make sure that it is fit for human habitation, that means free of vermin, free of chronic condensation and damp, free of faulty wiring that might cause fires. In other words, the category 1 houses that you're familiar with that are at risk to people's health and their very lives. Now sadly, this is still needed. But we've got the government backing now. The first stage of that bill has been passed, and what I really hope is that this is a piece of legislation that we will support through Parliament with some of the same conditions as we did for the homelessness reduction bill, but maybe in another 18 months' time we might be looking at a discussion like this which is about the implementation of that piece of new legislation, just like we are with the homelessness reduction bill now at the beginning of next month. Thanks very much.